Professor of African Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. His discourse and analytical research takes an intersectional approach to race, gender, and sexuality in traditional and social media texts. He's the author of White Belongings, Race, Property, and Land in Post-Apartheid South Africa, Lexington Books, 2022, and has published his work in a number of leading journals, including Men in Masculinities, Sexualities, Discourse, Context in Media and Environments and Planning, Nature and Space. Scott, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chanel, and really the honor is all mine. Thank you so much for putting this together. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to do it in 2 phases. So the first phase is going to look like this with my face on, there we go, on the presentation. And then in the second phase, I will be switching out of this view. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you for being here on a Saturday morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm going to start off this morning's discussion with Edward Said. In his 1994 book, Culture and Imperialism, Said examines how European imperial adventures were energized, promoted, and legitimated in metropolitan cultures. Colonialism needed political and financial support, but it also needed popular support. Real people had to devote their energies to empire, to involve their families in its workings, to take risks, and not all of them survived the dangers of these adventures. Said argues for a focus on how stories of the land come into these colonial cultures. He writes, "Everything about human history is rooted in the earth, which has meant that we must think about habitation, but it has also meant that people have planned to have more territory and therefore must do something about its indigenous inhabitants. At some very basic level, imperialism means thinking about, settling on, controlling land that you do not possess, that is distant, that is lived on and owned by others. Thinking about controlling other people's lands is also inevitably wound up with thinking about other people. And this is, of course, where the pseudoscience of race comes in handy as a legitimation strategy for robbery, enslavement, and genocide. Imperial and colonial projects need character sketches of the noble European and the savage for telling stories back to the metropole. And these stories, as Said also argues, are central to the appropriation and control of foreign lands. He writes that the main battle in imperialism is over land, of course, but when it came to who owned the land and who had the right to settle and work on it, and who kept it going, who won it back, and who now plans its future, these issues were reflected, contested, and even for a time decided in narrative. These narratives and their main characters do not simply vanish when the colonial period is over. They have afterlives. In this book, White Belongings, which I'm talking about today, I was interested in the ways that colonial discourses of the land continue to structure the supposedly post-colonial present, specifically in South Africa. And I was interested in my people, as it were, the white settlers, and the ways in which the elements of the racial order might inhere in the way we think about our connection to the land as white people in South Africa today. Of course, the whole idea of land being wound up in culture is a lesson that indigenous people have been teaching the world for a long time. The Australian first Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, Mick Dodson, put it this way in 1997. Everything about Aboriginal society is inextricably interwoven with and connected to the land. Culture is the land. The land and spirituality of Aboriginal people, our cultural beliefs or reasons for existence is the land. You take that away and you take away our reason for existence. We have grown the land up. We are dancing, singing, and painting for the land. We are celebrating the land. Removed from our lands, we are literally removed from ourselves. This quote, by the way, is also used by Raewyn Connell in her Southern theory as a key argument for her model of starting with land in sociology. Whiteness studies, the tradition of the study of race and racism in which I wrote this book, seeks to turn the ethnographic gaze onto white people and white ways of thinking about the world. So I wanted to ask, how are white people singing and dancing the land, as it were, and what does this mean for the perpetuation of racial inequality in South Africa? Depressing as it is to admit, at the statistical level, Thabo Mbeki's characterization of South Africa as two nations in his famous 1998 parliamentary address seems as apposite today as it was 25 years ago. He stated that one nation is, I quote, white, relatively prosperous, and has ready access to a developed economic, physical, educational, communication, and other infrastructure, while a second and larger nation is black and poor, living under conditions of a grossly underdeveloped economic, physical, educational, communication, and other infrastructure with virtually no possibility to exercise what in reality amounts to a theoretical right to opportunity. Increasingly, contesting this inequality has hinged on the question of land redistribution. 35,000 white commercial farmers own 72% of agricultural land in South Africa. At the same time, they account for less than 1% of the white population, which numbers about 4.7 million. Even whites who don't own much land are doing dramatically better than black people in South Africa. Statistics South Africa reports that the median annual expenditure of white households is 10 times that of black households. According to the 2021 report from the Commission for Employment Equity, black people account for 80% of the employment active population and yet occupy only 16% of top management jobs, while 65% of top managers are white, though they account for only 9% of the employment active population. A recent Stats SA report found that 43.9% of black men are unemployed and 51% of black women. Depending on the definition, 63 to 73% of black South Africans live in poverty, while only 0.9 to 1.8% of white people do. So the first 20 years of ANC rule, in fact, saw poverty levels decline among white people. They reduced by half, a bigger reduction than any other group in the country. So some of the biggest winners of the end of apartheid have in fact been white people. Now, we all know, of course, that race is a social construction without biological essence. Racial structure had to be engineered in South Africa and made to appear natural. And yet the end of apartheid and the advent of multiracial democracy has failed to substantially restructure the racial order. Though we have plenty of white racism in South Africa, racism per se is on the scale of apartheid at least, is widely denied by white people and thought of as relegated to the past. And yet apartheid seems to be alive and well. The simple answer to the question of why this should be the case is that racial capitalism was never dismantled in 1994. It has continued to be legitimated under the new dispensation and has lost very little of its power. So the economic structure of apartheid clearly remains. But the question I want to contribute to in this book is where continued white dominance gets its symbolic authorization from. The symbolic and the material, in my understanding, are in a dialectical relationship, and the relative stability of the non-racial order over nearly 3 decades requires us to understand what is happening at the symbolic level, rather than merely restating the obvious facts about the material. To theorize this, I do discourse analysis, and the model of discourse that I adopt is based on Thomas Martilla's model of post-foundational discourse analysis, which is in turn an attempt to develop a workable methodology for Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe's post-Marxist discourse theory. I won't go into all of the details here, except to say that this approach theorizes subject positions or roles as being motivated or rationalized in particular discourses. Performing this role of the subject works both to validate and materialize the discourse itself. Together with discourses that have been sedimented in institutions, subject roles and discursive formations constitute discourse regimes. A paradigmatic example of a subject role is the entrepreneur in neoliberal market economies. It is associated with discursive formations that are articulated around values related to starting businesses and institutions such as flexible labor laws, venture capital, traditional financiers, business incubators, and the like. Where there is power, of course, there is resistance. And discursive acts can work either to confirm, which in this model is called sediment, or to challenge, which we call reactivating the particular discursive formation. Discourses are composed of a specific number of elements articulated around particular values, and discursive acts are thus referred to as articulations, ways of making the elements organized around a value. Acts or events that reactivate a specific articulation can work to erode existing hegemonies, so they have a counter-hegemonic potential when we effectively critique the way that they work. Our discursive acts can confirm, for example, in the example of the entrepreneur, their value to society, saying, yeah, they're great, make them look cool, write puff pieces in Business Day and Financial Mail about them. Or we can bring up Elon Musk and other pillocks like that and, erode this figure of the mighty entrepreneur as somehow being at the center of progress and all that is good and modern. These critiques will only, however, amount to a viable challenge to the reigning discourse regime if they are able to somehow explain social life in a way that social actors can understand it as a social vision and develop a passionate affinity for a different way of looking at the world. So it's not an externally provable truth about a discourse that secures its repetition and sedimentation, but rather its rhetorical, affective, and cognitive dynamics. So we're not dealing here with, is this true or not? We're dealing with, can a discourse give us a social vision that we develop some kind of passionate affinity for? Hegemonic discursive regimes are relatively stable, but always potentially in the process of being undermined and broken down as people develop passionate affinities for competing explanations of social life. And the reason I use terms like hegemony or hegemonic is that I think this is a useful way to think about whiteness. As the philosopher Paul C. Taylor argues, whiteness relies on a system of ideas and images that provides a kind of common sense background for much of Western culture. Very often when we speak of hegemonic whiteness, we refer to the persistence of white power and social position through different legislative and social upheavals. So things change, but whiteness always tends to stay on top. In the United States, for example, one could argue that whiteness remained hegemonic through the civil rights movement and all the way into the era of Clintonian colorblindness and through Black Lives Matter, through the Trump era, well into the Biden era, despite ongoing counter-hegemonic challenges. The point is not to, in saying that whiteness has remained hegemonic, is not to deflate counter-hegemonic practice. As Patricia Hill Collins has argued, we shouldn't be all doom and gloom about whiteness. What hegemony helps us to theorize is the importance of resistance and of counter-hegemonic practice, even if it doesn't actually succeed in shifting the overarching hegemony. Hegemony places political action and intellectual elaboration of social visions at the very heart of organizing for social change. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, the essence of hegemony, as theorized by Antonio Gramsci, is the spontaneous consent of the masses to the direction of social life. So hegemony is not brute force, but rather common sense. It's when things appear to be normal, natural, and rational. In the South African context, Steve Biko and the Black consciousness movement mobilized a broadly Gramscian analysis of apartheid in South Africa. Biko famously argued that the mind of the oppressed is the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor. And he believed that Black liberation must start with intellectual and psychological struggle and the development of Black consciousness. Black consciousness is crucial because so much of white consciousness is wrapped up in ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen, as W.E.B. Du Bois famously wrote. The Gunpool scholar Eileen Morton Robinson argues that this is the white possessive, It's a socio-discursive regime that, I quote, ontologically shapes the formation of white subjectivity. For Morton Robinson, the possessive can be achieved with or without legal ownership. It is related to the notion of self-possession, a sense of control over one's own mind and body that historically worked to produce the European imperialist and his desires as the source of rational social ordering. That white people should own, govern, and rule the land is thus not merely a hangover from colonialism and apartheid, but a rationality, a logic, a way of being a settler that has achieved some measure of hegemony, even in South Africa, against which a counter-hegemonic discursive act is required. So I'm going to be looking at one element of that hegemonic discourse regime today. And that element basically is going to be in two data sets where I look at a Facebook group of South Africa's largest campaign against fracking in the Karoo and a selection of artifacts from the campaign to stop rhino poaching. So as I'm sure you will pick out, these are both examples of green or environmentalist discourse. So I am arguing that environmentalism plays a key role in the reproduction of the white possessive in South Africa. In South Africa, environmentalism has often been criticized as being structured by white priorities and ways of looking at the land. In the early 1990s, Deputy President of AZAPO, Dr. Kgomolemo Mokai, made the point succinctly when he said that the green movement agitates on behalf of flora, of fauna, of the entire animal kingdom, with but one exception, black mankind. We have better things to do than run along with the bandwagons of ignorant white people who need an interest to fill their time. Assessing white involvement in celebrated transfrontier wildlife conservation projects in the early 21st century, the American anthropologist David McDermott Hughes argues that conservation provides an ongoing reason for white settler presence in in Africa, and that through conservation, they have reasserted a continental space commensurate with a particular white history and hope for the future. So I'm going to, in the analysis, elaborate and complicate these insights. Planned prospecting for natural gas in South Africa's central arid region, the Karoo, was initially gazetted in 2012. As a result, it sparked a series of spirited and ultimately successful opposition from a coalition of landowners, farmers, environmentalists, and local business owners, who asserted the sanctity and the perfection of the Karoo as central to their opposition to petrogas exploitation. The economy of the Karoo, largely focused on agriculture and tourism, was constructed as dependent on the conservation of its current landscape. Not dissimilar to, but perhaps to a greater extent than other regions in South Africa, the Karoo is typified by white farm and business ownership, while Black people live in conditions of poverty, social distress, and landlessness. This region is in many ways ground zero historically for the expropriation of land and the forced conversion of its inhabitants into cheap farm labor. My analysis of the campaign focused on its largest Facebook group, which is called Chase Shell Oil Out of the Karoo, and where the membership is, by my estimate, over 90% white. An important theme in the group's conversation revolves around images such as this one, where the Karoo is described in comments by group members in spiritual terms as a heartland and a place that touches your soul. The comments on this particular Facebook post from 2014 explicitly refer to this landscape in this photo as pristine, perfect, and God-given. Given that this image clearly shows a farm dam and a windmill, artifacts from 18th century settler expansion associated with land expropriation and colonial advance, we can see in action here how the Karoo is the place both where the historical contingency of colonialism is represented as preordained or natural, and as a kind of necessity. It is worth remembering what the advance of agriculture meant for indigenous people: expropriation, coerced labor, war, death. If the scene is pristine and perfect, then the marks of humanity on it are also naturalized. In this case, the entire violent colonial project is naturalized. When nature comes into history in ways that motivate a specific ethnic group's entitlement to occupy it, the British sociologist Anthony Smith has called this an ethnoscape. The ethnoscape is an eternal poetic landscape that makes cultural production of itself possible. So the Karoo becomes soul country for white people, associated with belonging. It is only through a strategic forgetting of settler colonialism and disregard for the ways that colonialism structures the racialized present that these kinds of constructions can play such a powerful affective role in organizing activism against fossil fuel extraction. So I'm now going to change the way that I'm sharing my screen so that I can show you a quick video. And so I'm going to drop out of the image. Okay. Just, can everybody hear this, the sound? Okay, great. So, so I'm going to show you a video now. Though openly ethno-nationalist groups such as AfriForum have played an important role in the campaign against fracking, it's also very important to note that white South Africans across the political spectrum connect with these environmentalist campaigns. This 2-minute anti-fracking video is made by a popular, liberal, left-leaning even, white South African musician called David Kramer. And it was shared on the Facebook group that I analyzed. So I'm just going to play the whole clip for you now.
Ken jy die Karoo, bly slang en akkedus. Baie jare terug was hy akkedus, vis nog kry jy skulpe, en die rotse jy kry skiedels en jy klei. Hierdie hele droe wereld, onder water glo vir my, onder water, onder water. Hierdie hele droe leegte was onder water glo vir my. There's a place, a vast and beautiful place, an ancient place. It's a place I come from, and it's a place I write about, and it's a place that's inspired me in my music. It's called the Karoo, and now the Karoo is under threat from multinational corporations that want to explore for gas under the ground by a process called fracking. And I believe that fracking is an environmental disaster in the making, and it's going to affect all of us, all South Africans. So I want you to please raise your voices, lobby your politicians, you know, and stand up for your constitutional rights for a clean environment and say no to fracking in the Karoo. Fracking is not an option. There must be a better way. Let's find it together.
So before I analyze this video, I want to make a quick aside, if my computer will let me. There we go. In his important book, Whiteness in Zimbabwe, David McDermott Hughes traces the different ways that Lake Kariba is represented in 20th century white writing. From opposition to building this huge dam, which was described as an offense against nature in the 1950s, white Rhodesians eventually mythologized what is today the world's largest artificial lake. It was gradually absorbed into the scenery and became part of the imagined ecosystem. Hughes writes that there was an author who wrote in 1976 that if a dinosaur walked out, it would not surprise me. Kariba was thus represented in the white Rhodesian imagination as having existed since time immemorial. An artificial dam built by colonial administrators thus went within less than 2 decades from the target of protest to an eternal lake, imagined as existing in geological time, something that was always there. I argue that a related gesture is at work in Kramer's song, though with key distinctions. The shells in the rocks and the skeletons in the clay exist as proof that this landscape is far older than any human settlement. But Kramer knows this landscape. It is his claim to knowledge, connection, and belonging, which I argue is salient here. We must believe him, the white protector of this land, the one who knows, because his connection is to the real Karoo, the one that was underwater. His connection is rooted in geological time and supported by real scientific knowledge. He does not mention the history of colonial dispossession, the stories and the cultural systems linked to the land that were swept away by European settlement, the processes that secured his presence on the land in the first place, or other ways of knowing the land. His authority to speak and to say that he comes from the land is linked to a particular way of knowing the land that obscures these histories. So his assertion that he comes from an ancient place is simultaneously a gesture to autochthony, to having sprung from the land itself, to always having been there. While Kramer occupies a broadly progressive anti-racist positionality, as well as that of an environmental activist, I argue that these kinds of ways of looking at the land are inseparable from the more oppositional politics of us versus them, which we see in this Facebook group. Black politicians and industrialists are typically constructed as arrogant, stupid. They want to improve the land, but the land is already perfect. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. So they're the people against whom most of the group's anger is directed. This frontier between us and them is sometimes explicitly racialized, but more usually, racial division is left implicit. We'll see the same tension in the next data set, which is all about race without necessarily naming race at any point. The rhino poaching crisis in South Africa has been raging for over a decade, and various attempts to deal with it have been described and deconstructed in the critical political ecology literature. Armed responses to conservation threats throughout the world have been critiqued in this literature as green militarization in support of fortress conservation. Hundreds of extrajudicial killings of poachers or would-be poachers or suspected poachers who may actually not be poaching in border zones in Southern Africa are associated with what has amounted at times to a low-scale war. Bram Bisher and Manu Ramotsindela have argued that militarization is only one type of green violence perpetrated in the name of conservation. They and others have identified countless examples of discursive violence, which pits a largely white and middle-class activist public against largely poor and black poachers living in or near border zones. In my analysis of the campaign materials, to get the public to support attempts to address this poaching crisis, I focused on the ways that race, gender, and sexuality were imbricated in forming subject positions. So many campaign materials have turned the rhino horn into a penis symbol that it is worth exploring what sex and sexuality might have to do with the rhino horn. A useful discursive entry point into this data set is the work of Frantz Fanon, who theorized racism as rooted in the colonial cultural unconscious, which he characterizes as, I quote, a constellation of postulates, a series of propositions that slowly and subtly, with the help of books, newspapers, schools and their texts, advertisements, films, radio, work their way into one's mind and shape one's view of the world of the group to which one belongs. Fanon argues that in colonial texts, blackness is constructed in opposition to whiteness, as darkness and sin are to innocence and magical heavenly light. The good white and bad black coalesce into archetypal figures called imagos, and the black imago, or black satyr, plays a role in the development of the white self as the unassimilable and perfect other. The black imago may appear to the white person during times of depression or anxiety as a satyr or murderer, becoming the mainstay of his preoccupations and desires, argues Fanon. This includes the common white fixation with the supposed bestiality of black men and the size of their penises, which supposedly turn the white man's penis into a little toy, a fact that symbolically castrates the white man. Opposed to the black imago is the white father, who, Fanon writes, is charged with maintaining order in it as a garrison controls a conquered city, and where it is the consciousness of the growing child. For white children, the authority of the white father harmonizes with and is analogous to the authority of society, which they will have to adjust to in a normal way in order to become independent agents in the world. So Fanon is arguing that, like, deep in the colonial unconscious, deep in the way that children are raised in these societies, there are these ideas playing around there, whether we know about them or not, right? So let's look at some rhino poaching materials. I saw this bumper sticker while driving to work one morning about 10 years ago on the back of a car on Jan Smuts Avenue, a major thoroughfare in Johannesburg. It reads simply, as you can see, dried testicles of rhino poachers can cure AIDS. At first blush, the joke seems pretty simple, but unpicking the way that it works proves quite revealing. This text relies on the audience's familiarity with a number of discourses, which in a typically South African fashion are all intricately racialized. The first is the discourse of HIV/AIDS. For reasons that include higher levels of poverty and access to inferior healthcare, Black people in South Africa bear the brunt of the HIV epidemic. According to the most recent national survey, prevalence among white people is about 0.3%. Among Black people, it's as high as 15%. This difference is known widely in society and features in white rationalizations of the sexual undesirability of Black people. Another discourse or discourse genre is that of medical pamphleteering, where making bold medical claims on a city street about the efficacy of a natural ingredient as a cure for a sexually transmitted infection references the discourse of traditional African medicine advertising, which tends to focus on sexual prowess, fertility, and success in life and love, as Edwards and Milani have argued. The medical practice itself of using a dried animal part for curing an illness goes by the isiZulu word for medicine, umuthi. This reference to traditional medical practice has at least three dimensions. Firstly, many ancient medical practices observe the doctrine of signatures, which is the idea that appearance suggests use. A commonly held belief is that rhino horn, used as a medicine, promotes a better erection. In the South African context, umuthi also has the specific association of so-called muti killings, where humans are supposedly killed for their body parts to be used as medicine. These gruesome crimes are a staple of South African tabloids, as well as a preoccupation of elements of the Western press. Furthermore, magical cures for AIDS reference the myth of the virgin cure, the idea that HIV-positive men were raping children, whom they knew would not be infected with HIV in order to cure themselves. This is a further example of the doctrine of signatures, where the consumption of virginal purity achieves purification. This motivation for sexual violence is unsupported by any evidence, but this partly explains why it's such an enduring story that is told in South African society. So what we have in this joke, I argue, is a Fanonian constellation of images that panders to specifically white colonial ideas about Black masculinity. Remember that for Fanon, the Black imago or satyr is a penis symbol. The stereotypes of uncontrolled Black sensual license and libido are mobilized in this bumper sticker, which constructs two audiences. The first is superstitious, bloodthirsty, and desperate enough to find and castrate poachers in order to dry and grind up their testicles. This pretend audience, which is really just set up to make the joke work, is being constructed as a portrait of a Black man who, in the South African racial imaginary, is saddled with the reputation of being violent, HIV positive, and likely to rape and kill. The myth of the virgin cure for HIV and the reference to the genre of traditional medical pamphleteering do the work here of indicating who it is who is going to do the killing, who is going to poach the poacher. The second audience, of course, is the one that is supposed to laugh. These are the ones driving behind this car on Jan Smuts Avenue who are supposedly would find this kind of sexed and raced stereotype funny, who find the idea of setting one violent black man on another violent black man amusing, something worth laughing at. So in this text and others that I've found, we have clear evidence that this constellation of imagery is very much in operation. But how are white people represented in the fight against fracking? These are two rectangular louvered billboards that were placed in parallel in the domestic terminal of OR Tambo International Airport in March 2015, containing the statement, "Come together to protect what's ours," and a call to donate 10 Rand to the campaign by sending an SMS. And branded with a familiar logo of the South African brewery's flagship beer, Castle Lager. The South African breweries have been articulating a South African masculinity as central to their beer brands since at least 1960. Sports sponsorship and advertising have been central to this project. The bottom billboard consists of an image of famous white South African cricketer Mark Boucher. His cricket whites replaced with the standard khaki uniform of the game ranger on the left, and a multiracial human chain here in the middle, in a wilderness setting around a family of rhinos in the center. On the right, the logo of Castle Lager, which looks like a shield or crest of arms, has been amended to include the text Boucher's legacy, and combined with an image of a rhino and the motto, "Our rhinos in safe hands," a reference to Boucher's performance as wicketkeeper on the national team. And this is echoed on the two large mid-covered hands that symbolically protect the rhino. After 1994, particularly, SAB, the South African breweries, deployed a Rainbow Nation narrative to sell beer to an ever-diversifying market, something that Eusebius Makaza has critiqued a number of times. And the human chain around the rhino is consistent with the brand's positioning. Indeed, SAB has consistently marketed itself as multiracial. The fact that the leader of this campaign is a white sportsman, however, is crucial. In certain sports, in the economy, and in elite pursuits such as conservation and game farming, the people taking on leadership roles are still white, still men, and as in the heydays of Afrikaner nationalism, still wearing khaki. Black people are in the background as protectors and collaborators with other white people. A territorial metaphor is also operationalized in this text, where the multiracial crowd led by Boucher is forming a chain. It becomes a fence or a border that closes the rhinos off from the bad people. So it's an argument for that kind of fortress conservation model. In this campaign to get people involved in protecting rhinos, the enigmatic animals are represented as having a central role in national identity. So with the beer, the sport, and the white leadership in the protective hands, the rhino is there. So poaching of rhinos evokes very strong emotions in nature lovers, as well as offering an outlet for more general feelings of rage and violence pent up in the white minority, as Bisher and Ramutsindela have argued. While the problem of green militarization and violence is a global one, in South Africa, the extrajudicial killing and torture of poachers is legitimated through the construction of specific active fictions that interweave discourses of race, gender, and sexuality. I haven't analyzed the Asian man, but the Asian man in these discourses tends to be feminized. He must pay the oversexed African man to kill the rhinos so that he, the Asian man, can get an erection. And so the only man you can trust who has the right amount of masculinity is the central one, the white father, who is, as you'll remember from Fanon, charged with maintaining order as a garrison controls a conquered city. The white father appears in anti-poaching texts at the confluence of discourses of patriotic authenticity and authority as a celebrity sportsman wearing khaki, the axis around which the white heteropatriarchal family turns. So while the non-racial nation is powerfully reaffirmed in the imaginaries of South Africa's preeminence in sports, wildlife protection, and patterns of middle-class consumption, the prismatic rainbow is produced as best focused through the leadership of a white man. The white man has neither too much masculinity like the black poacher, nor too little like the Asian consumer, and can therefore be trusted as the steward of the rhino, and by extension of the land itself. He symbolically coordinates the construction of the cordon between animals and people, ensuring security for South Africa's enigmatic wildlife in treasured protected areas. And thus, in an ironic twist, the contemporary beneficiaries of racial fictions that enabled the historical decimation of African fauna and flora have now been re-signified as the ecosystem's last hope for protection from barbarian hordes. So what does this mean for the discourse regime? As you can see, discursive formations work to motivate or rationalize specific subject roles and institutions, which in turn validate or materialize the formation itself. Subjects corroborate the institutions, which in turn subjectivate the subjects. In an era where white land ownership, privilege, and belonging is coming under sustained political attack from a number of quarters, we can see that this discursive formation is being reactivated. In other words, there's an attempt to say, hey, hang on a minute, this doesn't make any sense. Why are white people still controlling the land? And we see that in the Izweletu, the land back movements, etc., and the discourse of the EFF of expropriation without compensation, etc. So there's an attempt to reactivate the colonial assumptions around these institutions, subjects, and discourses. The arbitrary and metaphorical nature of white land domination is being drawn attention to, right? That's what happens in the reactivation. I argue that these environmental campaigns are part of a process that sediments or tries to re-sediment, tries to repair established landholding patterns. Because environmental protection is not articulated around a logic of ownership for the sake of ownership, but for a higher purpose, saving the earth and its biodiversity, it attempts to secure the passionate affinity of the people in general, not necessarily just white people, who might otherwise see land holding patterns in South Africa as unfair. I call this discursive formation ecological indigeneity. Threats of poaching or fracking serve as important motivations for the sanctity of private property and the necessity of securitization. So the institutions here are things like enclosing the land, strong ownership rights, fortress conservation, big fences, sending people with guns to protect those fences. So when Karoo landowners in the anti-fracking movement talk about meeting the threat of fracking, they say that they're going to see off the frackers with locked gates and loaded shotguns. And rhino lovers celebrate armed rangers and their shoot to kill trigger happiness. Private property is produced as the right to exclude strangers from land on pain of death. These institutionally sanctioned entitlements to defend land and wildlife are articulated around the value of nature. So environmental protection and, all of that good green stuff that everybody likes are the values that we articulate this discourse around, right? The beautiful and supposedly pristine agricultural Karoo or wildlife area where the rhinos are is produced as a heartland, as soul country, while the enigmatic, majestic rhino is embraced as a member of the Rainbow Nation. In the process, white people are reproduced not just as owners of land, but as its protectors. They belong on the land and are connected to it in geological time. So erasures of historical enclosures, exclusions, and genocides mystify racialized landholding patterns, producing innocent white ecological subjects whose production of the land as an ethnoscape naturalizes their history as being indigenous to the land. So the ecological subjectivity is wound up in this claim to indigeneity, to rootedness in geological time. White dominance in conservation and environmentalism is further rationalized by a supposed innate readiness to lead these efforts and an intrinsically rational approach to the history and future of the land. The role of the white conservationist is to confirm and protect the borders of securitized ecological property, while the existence of these spaces necessitates the presence of these paragon stewards of the land in the first place. So we see there the corroboration and the subjectivation working in tandem. In environmental stewardship, white liberal subjectivity after apartheid has thus found its own justification for continued domination. While many continuities with historical, colonial, and Bantustan discourses are in evidence, this articulation is very much at home in the post-1994 liberal order. It is important to note that this discourse regime does not appeal explicitly to race or racist values, but to the protection of nature, the inviolability of property, the truth of science, and to whites having a deep-rooted claim to belong on the land. To the extent that it corroborates liberal institutions and reproduces the structural arrangements of the post-apartheid order, the discourse of ecological indigeneity thus works to sediment the form of liberal non-racialism that became hegemonic after 1994. And I argue that it's just one part of a broader system. I don't analyze all of the system, but in the other data sets I look at in the book, I argue that there are other strategies which include establishing white entitlement and belonging through claiming injury and victimization, that white people are disproportionately affected by crime and poverty in South Africa, and that therefore we need enclave entrepreneurialism. Enclave entrepreneurialism is the kinds of institutions that are private initiatives by entities such as AfriForum, the Afrikaner Rights Group, which advocates for being allowed to carve out more privatized space and responsibility for whites-only projects in the new South Africa, which they can run as entrepreneurial entities so that they balance out, they make a profit without putting any burden on the state. So they're constantly making the argument that they can take care of the poor whites, they can take care of energy production, they can take care of water, sanitation, etc., etc., etc. They're trying to carve out these enclaves that they can take again for themselves as whites-only spaces. Implicit in all of this, of course, is the value of market liberalism, which the country capitulated to largely in the 90s. And that's, of course, a whole other topic of conversation around that moment in the 90s where the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, etc., and South Africa's transition happening at more or less the same time when the tide had turned against socialist ways of thinking about property and organizing society. So what, in conclusion, does this amount to? Quite simply, when I say white belongings, I refer both to how white subjectivity has become interwoven with an imagined countryside or ethnoscape in which white people belong and the reproduction of their entitlement to possess the land. So it's both property and heartland coming together. Eileen Morton Robinson's socio-discursive regime, the white possessive, is thus intimately interwoven with a claim to autochthony, with a kind of manufactured indigeneity. Protecting the earth is constructed as continuous with accessing, owning, or enjoying it, or consuming space in a commodified form. This is culturally elaborated around a sense of its being the colonizer's rightful home. Landscapes, as produced in contemporary South Africa, reflect the identity of that settler back to the subjects, whose social roles and institutions are also legitimated in relationship to the protection of the earth. Thanks very much. That's it from me. And if you want to buy the book, which is ridiculously expensive, you can email me, or you can get a 30% discount by using that code. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was a really great presentation. I now give over to Prof. Makoni for initial comments and conversation.
Scott, this was a very useful presentation. You put me in an awkward position because I'm not sure how I'm supposed to ask you a question, but I guess I'll have to pretend that you're not part of the organizing team of the forum, and just assume that we just invited you, because otherwise I can't ask you any useful questions. Okay, let me start. Politically, in terms of the political systems in South Africa, what really happened that enabled the white South Africans to still dominate both the economy, the educational system, now more so than they ever did even at the end of apartheid? Because the impression that I get is that the differences between blacks and whites in South Africa are getting even more and more accentuated the further we leave the 1994 elections. What is it that the dominant African National Congress Party did wrong that has produced this particular nightmare for the blacks?
So there's a lot of work in that space that's ongoing, and in fact some of it was even being presented in the late 90s. I mean, I think it was what's his name, Bond, who talked about the total capitulation to neoliberalism.
Yes.
In the 90s, yeah. So the private enterprise in South Africa were some of the first people to open talks with the African National Congress, those famous in Zambia, I think they were. I'm not an expert on this history, but the approach by industry to the liberation movement for a role in a post in a multiracial South Africa at the same time as the collapse of the Soviet Union and all of the kind of the intellectual and material support for socialist social visions, combined with, I think, arguably a tendency to kind of a quite conservative form of African nationalism in the African National Congress itself. So one can question the extent to which the African National Congress was ever truly a socialist movement, So it proved so easy in the mid-90s to kind of jettison those elements of the Freedom Charter that didn't seem to be that didn't seem to give South Africa this warm welcome back into the community of nations that people seem to have wanted at that point, right? There's a whole series of workshops that are actually, you can watch them on YouTube, where you could see Cyril Ramaphosa and other ANC and union leaders going to something called the Le Fleur scenarios, which was held at like a wine farm in the Western Cape in 1992, I think. And you could see the way they developed these scenarios, and they did this whole scenario planning exercise where, like, the socialist vision for a new South Africa was basically described as the I think it was the dodo or something like that. They had, like, they gave each of these scenarios the name of a bird, and the socialist one ended up being the extinct one, the one that wasn't going anywhere, the one that had no movement in it. And this was facilitated by industry, right? It was very much a warm embrace of trade unionists, private enterprise, and the liberation movement coming together. So what we essentially had is we had nobody to speak for a social vision that did not protect the sanctity of property. And, saying this as a white South African who lived through those years is quite a strange thing to be saying, because, of course, everyone was hoping at that point that, there wouldn't be massive expropriations, that there wouldn't be some kind of like break, and by everyone I mean, like, white, like people who were sort of broadly thought of themselves as liberals. So all of that kind of power came behind a project that was essentially a market liberal project, and that has become increasingly more neoliberal. So in all of the ANC's policy decisions over the past 30 years, we've seen that kind of the neoliberal logic basically just run rampant within the state. Less government responsibility, always pushing the responsibility back to people, to communities, trying to get non-profits to do the work of government, complaining about government capacity, and not substantially presenting South Africa with a social vision beyond the racial capitalist one that we've always had, where the only solution to our problems is more mines, foreign direct investment into various aspects of our industry, so that people can get, employed. So I think, that's a rather long and perhaps rather badly organized way of saying that, I think that's where it went wrong for South Africa.
Okay, that's interesting because we are negotiating at the moment with Thabo Mbeki's office when he may come to the forum, and we have a fixed date for Mampela Rampela, who was the first Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, and Mark Over. So it's going to be very interesting to get these prominent Black South Africans insight into what went wrong to create the nightmare that seems to get worse and worse. But anyway, let me leave that aside. The other issue that you talked about when you talk about whiteness, but the whites in South Africa differ in terms, you've got Germans, Italian, you've got English, etc. Are there any subtle differences in how these various groups relate to land, for example, first? And then my second question is, even within the Afrikaner communities, are there any gendered differences in terms of their orientation to land? Do the women relate to land differently from the men, etc.? Yeah.
So I'm going to answer the second question. I think there certainly the relationship to land is gendered, but it's not necessarily like on a, that women relate in this way and men relate in that way.
Yeah.
That certainly in the broadly speaking, and I mean, this is just such a reduction that like most people I think would not necessarily recognize themselves in this, but broadly speaking, for, I think there is an English speaking white South African relationship to land as scenery, property, capital, commodity, etc. Right? Lifestyle. Broadly speaking, again, these reductions are problematic, but broadly speaking, I think Afrikaans families have a different history with the land that is articulated a lot more around the heteropatriarchal family and the idea of having a parcel of land that is yours to work and that you root yourself in that land, and that defense and connection to that particular parcel, the working of the land, is essential to your identity and to your family. So I do think, and also we see that, of course, in the literatures that come out of these traditions. So most prominently in the Afrikaans farm novel tradition, you get a strong cultural elaboration of what it means to be connected to a particular farm, and the social relations that are linked to that. Whereas the English tradition tends to take a different tack, to see the land maybe as threatening sometimes, or to sort of like personify the land as being some kind of monster that one interacts with, like the Adamastor myth that I've also written about. But again, these are just kind of generalizations. They're not really like meant for individual recognition.
When you were presenting, I kept asking myself, what is my own orientation towards land? And I realized that two things were happening when you were talking. I understand land to be sacred, particularly those pieces of land in which my ancestors are buried, right? That I tend to regard those particular areas, those particular pieces of land as sacred. And that if I'm in Southern Africa and somebody is greeting me, they're not likely to say, to refer to me as the son of the land, but as a son of the soil who has come back. So they draw a distinction between the soil and the land. In Shona, that would be Manawepu, meaning the soil, right? So it is the soil that, but of course you need land to part of the soil, but it is the soil that is important in this particular thing. But anyway, that's not important. Let me ask the last question, because there are a lot of comments in the chat. These whiteness studies, in what other parts of the globe do you see similarities in terms of these issues that you were talking about? For example, we talk about green militarism, etc., and etc. Are there any other contexts around the globe in which you see what is happening in South Africa being played out as well?
Absolutely. So green militarization has been theorized extensively in South and Central America, where the same kind of like fortress conservation models are in effect. So in the African context, these I think fortress conservation was coined by Dan Brockington based on a study in East Africa. I'm not entirely sure, but certainly like a lot of the models that we're talking about here are African ones. But the political ecology of conservation around the world has increasingly turned away from these ideas of conservation sites as being like wildernesses free of people, which is the way that the mainstream conservation constructs them, to try to think of ways that conservation can be more convivial. So certainly the academic conversation from Asia to South America to Africa is very much around convivial conservation that doesn't exclude and harm people. So that's on the one hand. Then, of course, on the other hand, in terms of these relations to the land and the way that the land is spoken about and constructed in whiteness studies, there's a great literature from Australian scholars, such as Indigenous scholars such as Eileen Morton Robinson, and others. In the United States, there's been good work also on the links between environmentalism and the production of white space. And certainly, I see very similar tendencies here in the way that, for example, Native American place names and stories are taken up by white settlers as a kind of an empty space into which they can project their own belonging, So there's, some kind of recognition that, oh yes, this did used to be somebody else's land, but now we're kind of the guardians of it. We protect the land. We align ourselves with these absent presences of indigenous people on the land. Good. So yes, there's a lot of good work on that in a variety of different contexts. Okay, good.
Let me leave this let me stop, because there's a lot of people who want to comment with more useful things to say than I do. Chanel, over to you.
Thanks so much. Okay. I'll just start with two comments from Busi that I think are quite interesting, and I think it links to what Prof. Makoni was also saying. So the other Prof. Makoni is saying, it's interesting that he describes this place as a place of snakes and lizards. Local Black South Africans would describe it as a place where the umbilical cords are buried, especially the San people. And then she also goes on to say that San people will not think of it as a place where you will find skeletons in the clay, but where you will find the ancestral spirits. Where the ancestral spirits are resting, so different worldviews. So maybe just tagging onto those two comments, where is the role of the Khoi and San in your analysis, and where did that erasure take place? Just to tag onto what Prof. Busi Makoni was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So they do come. So there's two ways in which Khoi and San people appear in the corpus of texts I looked at on Facebook. The first is one that's very relatively positive. So one of the mayors of Burnett, I think he was for the DA at that point, Dankie Jafta, was also identified himself as the chieftain of of a particular local clan, right, or the Inkwa clan. And he was supportive of the anti-frackers. So you did get a real indigenous person who was sort of part of their discourse, even though he never joined the Facebook group, he never posted on the Facebook group. So it was very much kind of like he was being represented as being anti-fracking. So that, I think, that's good. At least there's like a real person there. But by and large, Khoisan people in the corpus are absent presences. They're ghostly presences. So they're being invoked in order to claim the role of protector. People talk about, one of the Facebook comments was, where are the San people? They have the copyright on the land. And the idea of the copyright on the land linked, of course, to the idea of the paintings, so petroglyphs and kind of artwork in caves. So this association, again, with this like historical figure that is still basically painting a cave, but that is not there, that is not in any way politically salient or active. We have to ask, where are their voices? Because they certainly aren't part of our group that's on here posting on Facebook about how we hate fracking. There were a number of instances where they were there, but they were only there as a way to project a white connection to land and a speaking for indigenous people. And of course, no mention of what being the descendant of settlers in that land means for the indigenous people, like what that historically represented in terms. People talk about the Karoo as being a place of quiet, of beautiful history. There's a lot of this kind of like nice story of how everything is so, people love each other and we're a community and all of these things, which, completely erases the wars, the genocides, the forced removal, all of those things make no appearance whatsoever.
Thanks, Scott. There's also another comment by Busi Makoni in relation to Prof. Makoni's first question. I also think that the Freedom Charter started being chipped away during the CODESA agreements, while it was understood at the time that the desire to attract foreign investments in the country to avoid an economic downturn limited any potential for the implementation of any socialist agenda. But there was an implicit understanding that after the GNU, we will get back to the tenets of the Freedom Charter.
Yeah. Absolutely. As I said, I'm really not an expert on this history, but that account I think is very salient. Yeah.
If anyone else wants to ask a question, or you can use the raise hand function as well, please feel free to do that. Unyere, go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you may be. I have a question. I want to know, first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. Sorry, I didn't say that before. I want to know where or how Julius Malema's ideology of land expropriation without compensation factors into your discourse, or maybe not.
So at one point, actually, my next project was going to be a specific analysis of the public consultations on expropriation without consultation. So if anyone wants, I might in fact still do that, because there's extensive data on that. In the white discourse, Julius Malema tends to focus as a kind of like a scary, as a threatening figure. So in that basically reconfirms the discourse of injury and disadvantage. So there's a series of documentaries I analyze in the book about white poverty in South Africa. White poverty is a negligible phenomenon. There are something like, I think it's 32 informal settlements that are largely populated by white people in South Africa, compared to the thousands of informal settlements throughout the whole of South Africa. The numbers are just, horrific for people living in situations of absolute poverty. But white poverty has gotten so much media attention. And in one of the BBC documentaries on white poverty, we go to an EFF rally and we see Julius Malema jumping up and down and singing "Kiss the Boer, Kiss the Farmer," right? The sort of the version of the Dubulibunu song that supposedly is like more conciliatory. That's not saying kill the Boer, kill the farmer. And the BBC journalist at that point says, oh, you know, it's not very subtle, you know, that basically, well, he's basically just repeating kill the Boer, kill the farmer, even while he's saying kiss the Boer, kiss the farmer. So yeah, Malema is very crucial for the white discourse of entitlement and protection, in that he provides the bogeyman, you know, he provides the one that is most clearly threatening. So, you know, he, to a certain extent, like AfriForum and organizations like that are in a symbiotic relationship with elements of EFF discourse. So that's just sort of at the discursive level. Politically, I think that, you know, in the EFF's program, there is a lot of that kind of social vision that we were missing, or as Dr. Busi Makoni says in the chat, that we thought we were just postponing, you know, let's do some economic development first, then we'll have socialist policy, right? So I think the EFF on its good days is taking us back to thinking about what a social vision should be, that really does put the working class first and foremost, that really does see the heart of the nation as being people who are currently totally dispossessed. So putting the power back in the hands of those people. So I think that on their good days, that really is a salutary effect on South African discourse. On their bad days, of course, they, you know, there are indications that, you know, yeah, that the path to that utopia, or the path to that future that the EFF envisions, is not one that is going to bring along a sense of the people working together and a sense of what Laclau and Mouffe would call radical democracy, you know, that, you know, we're all equally valued. And it does, you know, they do show other signs of other tendencies in their movement. But certainly at the discursive level, the things that they're committed to make a lot of sense.
Thanks, guys. There are still no questions, but I can just quickly pop in mine. How did you theorize settler colonialism in your book? I'm not sure if it's just me, but in a lot of the articles that I've been reading, there's a tension between settler colonial present and settler colonial pasts when it comes to talking about South Africa. And I'm not always sure what there is no definitive position, it seems, that academics take in South Africa. Some would say South Africa has a settler colonial past, and some would say it is a present, it is a presence. So maybe just your position on that. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but this is how I'm reading academia in South Africa.
I'll answer in the way that I sort of connect to the question of temporality. Something I found very useful to think with have been some of the critical geography work on thinking time in a settler colony. So there's a Canadian geographer called Andrew Baldwin who's written about whiteness as futurity, and the way that part of what the settler colony is doing is to project itself into the future, to make it seem as if it's the only way that we're going to solve problems, the only way to achieve prosperity for everyone, whether it's in Canada or in the United States or in South Africa or in Australia. That somehow the continued white supremacy is tied up in a better future. I find a lot of the questions in South Africa at the moment surrounding, for example, Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh's book, around like, are we, do we say we are post-apartheid, or do we say we're still in apartheid, I think, I don't know, like as a post-structuralist, I'm sort of, I kind of tend to feel, whatever we call it, let's just describe, let's explain the way it works properly. It matters less if we say, oh, this is still apartheid, or this is still settler colonialism. we know that we know that the white people are here because of settler colonialism. I don't know if it's that important whether or not we still conceive of white people as settler colonial people. I find it more interesting to look at the ways that materially and symbolically white people authorize themselves and their continued social position in South Africa. And of course, if we want to look at the histories, there will be differences between the processes that are happening now and those that were happening in the 19th century. So I suppose, in short, I don't really have a clear answer to your question.
Prof. Makone, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I want to jump in. I want to shift the discussion towards pedagogical issues to try and help me clarify a couple of things. Scott, assume the following scenario. You wanted to design 2 courses. One was on whiteness studies, and the other one was was going to revolve or center around issues about, let's say, critical race theory. What will be the differences? You have the same students, they've attended your course in whiteness studies. Now they've registered for the course on critical race theory. These same students who are attending the same courses with you, what is so different in whiteness studies when you compare it with the course that will be, let's say, you may have decided to teach on critical race theory? Right.
So largely those differences are going to come from the kind of the bibliographic trajectories that those fields have taken, and also the ones chosen canon.
Yes.
So in the book, I actually did discuss at length how problematic whiteness studies has been, and how in fact, there have been, several excellent critiques of how whiteness studies potentially kind of merely renovates white subjectivity, again, placing especially white academics at the center of the conversation about race, whereas critical race theory and ethnic studies and Black studies, etc., have Black bibliographies. Whiteness studies becomes a space that then white academics can come into. They can get research funding, they get lots of space, etc. There's also the Sarah Ahmed's critique about the noisiness of white protestations of guilt and responsibility for everything that's gone wrong in the world, how those really very often produce a good feeling, that owning up to colonialism, etc., makes one feel warm and fuzzy inside, and is a way of creating new systems of power that make the white subject, as she writes, into something that could be loved again. So as qua white subject, qua white, like white person. But so I think I would come from it, definitely pedagogically from that sort of bibliographic. And I argue that whiteness studies, there is this sort of this bibliography in the 90s that comes out of feminist theory, with the work of Frankenberg, and then actually Rudiger and Ignatieff, etc. White American sort of work. But I argue that there's, the critiques of whiteness and an attention to whiteness is something that W.B. Du Bois was doing, that Frantz Fanon was doing, that Sylvia Wynter is doing. It's something that is not, you don't have to commit to a particular bibliography in order to do it. Actually, we need to deconstruct whiteness.
So for you, then, to some extent, I could teach whiteness studies. I don't need to be white to teach whiteness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the best whiteness studies scholars have not been white people.
Okay. Right. Yes, Roy, is there anybody who wants to jump in?
Yes. There is a question. Karen Johnson, please go ahead.
Thank you, Scott. Such an interesting talk. Now I know something more about you than going to parties with Tommaso. I have a very simple question. It has to do with land and ownership of land and recognition of land. And in the last maybe 10 years, there's this sort of new cultural practice of signing your email message with and recognition to the land that your university sits on. And I've heard sort of both sides, that some say this is a sort of recognition of the indigenous people who founded this land and that we should do this. And I've heard others say it's a slap in the face to indigenous people to say, now I'm okay because I've recognized your land, even though I've taken it over. I wondered what you think about this cultural practice and how your work might inform the way we should talk about it.
Thank you for that question. So I faced that decision myself when I came to Penn State, and I was quick to not just put the land acknowledgement in my email signature, but to find a land acknowledgement that I thought was a powerful one, that actually sort of stated the case very, very clearly. So for me, I absolutely think that at one level, if it is merely a gesture, a symbolic gesture, it can almost be like a sealing of the deal of the colonial settlement, right? A way to say, oh, well, it's done, it's over. Thanks you all for this land. Yeah, we recognize it used to be yours, now it's ours, and we're just moving on. So I absolutely take that critique. The reason that I put it into my signature is as a way of reminding people, because very often when people talk about Penn State being a land grant university, they don't talk about that. I was very impressed to hear our president the other day saying the land wasn't granted, it was grabbed. That was quite cool. I mean, that would be nice to maybe go in the email signature, and I can quote her. The president said that. But what I'm shocked to see is that there are so few indigenous students on campus. I would expect a land grant university that understands that it's actually a land grab university to have huge amounts of space on this campus for indigenous students, to be giving people free education the whole way through, to be supporting them with a free ride. What do they call it? A full ride. To really be doing awesome things, to be using some of the millions and millions and millions of dollars that come in from that land grant to substantially change the way that indigenous or Native Americans' life chances play out in this country. So that's, I think, the gap there. So just having the email signature without something more material, I think is deeply problematic. So I keep the email signature there as a way to sort of prick and remind that we mustn't forget about this. We have to actually do something material about it.
Well, unfortunately, I think the central administration thinks that Pennsylvania residents are indigenous. They're the ones that get the discounts and get the the things that the university can offer. Whereas if you're from New Jersey, or you're from New York, or you're from somewhere else, and if you're international, oh my goodness, you have to pay even more. Anyway, thank you for answering that question. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Muzna, floor is yours.
Scott, thank you so much. Fascinating. Well, I guess that you know what I'm going to ask. Well throughout the whole presentation, I have, I have been trying to see where your examples and where your analysis echo with the place where I'm in now. So, with Israel/Palestine. So considering the increasing studies lately of trying to analyze what's happening in Israel-Palestine in relation to race, even me, myself, I have been recently engaged with figuring out how, being a speaker of Arabic actually functions as being of a different, or belonging or positioning yourself as a different racial other in the settler colonial context of Israel. So I wonder how your notions of land can be, applied within Israel-Palestine contexts. And to what extent do you think that we can talk about white belongings without being white? You know what I mean? Without being So I guess in terms of when we try to figure out how racializing practices that occur in fields of unequal relations of power, such as Israel-Palestine. So how can we utilize or employ your fascinating model of, how you kind of conceptualized the issue of white belongings with regard to race and land, and I would also maybe ask language, Israel-Palestine.
Yeah, I'm, of course, as you know, I'm not at all an expert in how ethnicity and race would work in or does work in Israel-Palestine. So I don't know in terms of race and ethnicity, and in terms and using that word white belongings, I really don't know. But I definitely see, and you've also taught me on occasion, that double-edged way that belonging works, right? That it is both through articulating that we are the rightful possessors and the protectors of this land, right? That we are the ones who know what to do with it. We know how to make it bloom. We know, how what the historical contours of this land are. This land is linked to our ancestral belonging, right? And dispossession and taking other people's things away so that they now belong to me, right? And we've also seen in that context how environmental projects are part of that. So turning areas, areas of Palestinian settlements into nature conservation, parks, trying to argue that the collection of wild herbs of the Atar is somehow like damaging the environment and that it must therefore be stopped. Like this full frontal assault on Palestinian landholding and land use rights using environmental arguments. So I think that there are definite parallels there. I don't know about this white thing. I don't know if that's going to be the right way to look at it in that context. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Tommaso Milani, you have the floor.
So we haven't rehearsed this one. It's a comment on Musna, and like a follow-up on Musna's comment. I just want to say that Roy Gafter, who is also here, and I are actually working together on a chapter drawing on Scott's research. So to go back to Marconi to say how much Scott also influences my research, precisely about Israel and the racialization, process of racialization in conjunction, especially with the an animal that has become like symbolic of Israel, which is the Nubian ibex, and we are taking some of Scott's arguments about South Africa and trying to apply them to the context of Israel. So we'll send you definitely the chapter, Musna, for your critical eye. But now to my question to Scott. So as I'm sure you know, Scott, I mean, there is an increasing interest in applied linguistics about theories of post-humanism. Of course, you do not identify as an applied linguist, thank goodness, because otherwise, we'll be in the same department. But someone like Alastair Pennycook has written a whole book called, Posthumanist Applied Linguistics, where he puts forward, arguments about how applied linguistics can gain from an engagement with, let's say, new materialism and the posthumanist turn. You are a discourse analyst. I just wanted to hear your thoughts, not necessarily about Pennycook, which you might not have read, but generally about posthumanism, because you have throughout your career engaged with nature, with animals, but very much from a discursive human, I would say, humanist perspectives. So what is your take on post-humanism?
So that is a big question, and it's something that I would like to explore a little bit more in my next project, where I'm going to be focusing specifically on environmentalist or discourse analysis of environmentalist texts, and because of course posthumanism has been incredibly influential in the environmental movement. And the idea of moving beyond anthropocentric and humanistic ways of understanding the world is sort of very, very central to a lot of green discourse. So I am busy looking into it a little bit more deeply, but my current perception is that there is at one level something that is quite obvious in terms of human agency, to make the point that human agency is constrained. And that we might think of ourselves as kind of being at the center of events, but actually we're not. Our agency is co-constructed with technology, ecology, the weather, animals, everything is impacting on what we do or we don't do, right? So trying to give an account of social life that sort of creates like a sleight of hand, where it seems as if human agency is all there is to account for, is at one level self-evidently not going to work, right? We do need something that takes into account all of the other kinds of inputs into agency. And I say that just because kind of the second thing that I want to say is that I do want to stop short of something that I've noticed in some environmentalist texts with posthumanism, which is a kind of a depoliticizing move, which makes it seem as if the agency of the natural world is something to be taken kind of at face value, and moving beyond anthropocentrism means to kind of like put ourselves above social and political concerns. So, for example, when we want to make a claim of justice on a powerful group in society, there are some strands of posthumanism that say, stop locating your thinking at a merely human level. Think about the animals and the plants, etc. And I think that is fundamentally depoliticizing, because it gives powerful groups the right to speak on behalf of nature, to speak on behalf of, the cosmos, and we see this in certain really strange ideologies that are emerging at the moment around effective altruism and things like that. That where any human action that somehow secures the future of the planet and the future of the human race, even if it requires, starving groups of people, or preventing reproduction, or, basically stamping on the rights of our fellow human beings, that's fine, because we've got the big picture in mind. And I think that that's something to be guarded against. I'm not saying that Alistair Pennycook would believe anything like that. I'm just saying that there is a tendency to paint over our relations between each other as human beings and our obligations to each other when we start making our unit of analysis like the whole world and everything in it. So I think, following a Native American theorist, Carl White, I agree that we must solve our relations between ourselves as humans, as that's our priority, to get the relations between humans right. That will help us to fix our relations with the natural world.
Thank you. Zintle, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Scott. I just want to piggyback, and I think you might know where I'm going with this, is how you're using human and how you see your work in relation to Sylvia Wynter's work. And I'm also thinking about work that has come out of Black feminist thought, Zakiya Jackson's work regarding her understanding of environmentalism and how it never considers Black women's bodies as land and so on. So the latter part of the question is going towards, how do you see your work in relation with Afro-pessimism? Do you see whiteness studies in conversation with Afro-pessimism? Or in what ways?
Yeah, again, I don't think that's a question I'm going to be able to do justice to. I do feel as if Afro-pessimism's kind of anchoring on social death sometimes, again, can drain the energy from counter-hegemonic action and activism. I think that, yeah, but again, this is not a particularly informed answer. This is my sense of, if we accept, right, that, that white supremacy and settler colonialism are global systems that basically have resulted in the pushing into the realm of social death and non-human status of Black people through slavery, through capitalism, through racial capitalism, etc., then it becomes hard to see how you would ever switch that over, right? How you would ever turn that into a reclamation of the human that goes above that. I mean, and again, I know that many of the theorists are thinking through how to get from Afro-pessimism somewhere else, although, kind of, it's just in the name, right? The pessimism is there to think like, how are we going to move beyond that social death from a position of social death into one of, reclaiming the human. So yeah, that's, again, it's not a particularly well-informed sense, but I always think that, like, the theorists that I like engaging with on this issue tend to be trying to say, how do we, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, pierce the future for hope, or like Nick Estes, like, make a crack in history. How do we find that space and exploit it and use it? And I'm not sure if Afro-pessimism can help with that. I really don't know.
Thank you. Prof. Busi Makoni?
Okay, thanks, Scott, for an enlightening talk.
Thank you.
I've seen the video that you played, and my initial reaction when I first saw it was, well, I never really thought much of it. I just thought it was that, well, it was just part of white mischief in South Africa. But today I realized that the truth to Mogaye's claim of colonial discourses valorizing everything else other than the Black human. I mean, we see land, we see clay as a proxy for land, is home for snakes and lizards. But when you follow this discourse where there's the valorization of the animals, whether they be rhinos or whatever, isn't there an internal contradiction in the colonial discourse where we know, at least from studies, that Blacks or Africans or people of color are subhumans? They are discursively constructed as animals, but are also not valorized as the other animals. So, well, as the snakes and rhinos and all that. So, and therefore not in need of being protected, but if anything else, to be disposable. So isn't there in this discourse some internal contradiction of some sort?
I once did a comparative study of anti-fracking movements in Australia, the UK, and South Africa, and there was this one Facebook comment on the Australian page that was basically saying, we have to act now to protect our nature, our flora, our indigenous people, it was like all of these, like, the things we possess, the nature, the Aborigines, this kind of line of things that is, what we are possessing as white Australians, essentially. So I think that there is you could see it as a contradiction, but it's certainly an element of that colonial mode of thinking that somehow indigenous people are close to nature, they're of nature, they're stuck in an eternal, almost kind of biological reality going around in circles. stuck in circular time, never really moving forward. And in the work on environmentalism in the United States, there's been also a lot of analysis of how Native Americans were constructed as being kind of like, sort of like the bison, like, that to protect them and to, either they were going to go extinct because they, were not fit to live in an industrial civilization, or, we can somehow conserve them. We can somehow, make space for their conservation. And so a lot of early American environmentalism is based on exactly that insight. So again, if it's not a contradiction, if you are not thinking in terms of a broader humanity, if you've got this, Sylvia Wynter's like, human, that rational enlightenment white human in your mind, then it's okay. So what happens here with making people part of nature and therefore in need of protection doesn't necessarily contradict white supremacy, I don't think. I don't know, but you think there's a contradiction there. Sorry, maybe I didn't quite understand the contradiction.
No, I do see the point when you say that, the early environmental discourses, Black people as such will be part of the possession, they are part of nature somehow. So they will be, in that way, there is no contradiction. But then perhaps there is also no contradiction. To me, there is a contradiction in the fact that you also note that in colonial discourses, the constant reference to a Black person is a subhuman, is not really a fully formed human, is an animal of some sort, but it's an animal that is not valorized but despised. So where is this discourse then? Do you protect this that you despise, or do you not protect it? I'm not sure in my mind where the Black person then falls in that colonial discourse. On the one hand, I can see that the Black person as a possession, as part of nature, then as something to be protected. But then on the other hand, the fact that there is the idea of being a despised subhuman, incapable of learning or doing anything useful, that's not really valorizing.
It reminds me of that apartheid thing about the native in urban areas was denatured, right? That somehow, like, for a Black person to be living in Johannesburg was unnatural. They should, home is the rurals, right? Home is the rural area. And if you're here, then there's something wrong with that. You're just like labor power, but natural place is back there. So that if you're out of that nature, if you're kind of speaking back, if you're being problematic, then you're despised, maybe. But if you're at home, out of sight and out of mind, being part of the scenery, being part of the landscape, you're less threatening.
Yeah. Tommaso?
Just to, as a comment to Busi, how the kind of the double-sidedness or that you are pointing plays out. There is a very interesting example in Sweden with the Sami, where the Sami was simultaneously despised and dehumanized, and in need of being humanized through Swedish civilization, which then meant complete assimilation, at the same time as a specific type of Sami, namely the reindeer herding Sami, should be segregated and, in a sense, protected and separated completely, and kept in their natural habitat. So you had this both assimilation and segregation at the same time in Sweden, which I think kind of speaks I believe speaks quite well to the complexity of the colonial project specifically in the context of Sweden, where this the dehumanization, the treating the Sam as an animal, plays both ways: despised, assimilated, and then protected part of them protected.
Thanks for that, Tommaso. It makes it much clearer.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much. Okay, I think I'm going to throw it to Prof. Makoni now for some concluding comments, and then we can head straight to the after part.
Okay, right. Scott, thanks a lot for this excellent discussion. I think it touches on some of the key themes that we've been struggling with throughout. What are the implications of some of these ideas in the different and diverse contexts that we all are working in? I was particularly interested in how you were able to articulate the pedagogical and educational implications of some of the work that you are dealing with on whiteness. There's only one minor comment I want to make, but I couldn't find the reference when I was preparing for this. Chanel may help me. There was a colleague who came to talk to us, who talked about what she was calling colored studies. Do you remember that, Chanel? I'll try and find the reference. It will have been very interesting to see if I could find the reference and read it, where these emerging colored studies fit into whiteness studies. But I think this is potentially a very interesting way of continuing this work. And then the other thing that you raised, which was interesting, was about this sort of post-humanism, etc., etc. For me, the crux of the problem there is how one defines what constitutes being human, and where you draw the distinction between being human and being non-human. I would like to resist the idea that there is one way of defining what it means to be human. And I intuitively prefer a view that sees being human as being locally defined, and the distinctions between being human and animal, human and nature is variable depending on the task at hand. Not so much that it is predetermined, but in the task at hand. And that sort of distinction has implications on a linguistics that I envision, which will never take place. That the linguistics that I envision is one that will then seek to develop, let's say, a conversational analysis of how humans may interact with animals and other species. I think that linguistics has foreclosed the discussion by restricting itself to an analysis of interactions between humans and humans. I think we open up a bigger area of analysis if we accept that humans may interact with other species other than ourselves, who also are part of this planet. Once you go that direction, then a lot of possibilities come into the place. But what tends to happen in linguistic textbooks is that they restrict everything. Language is human, and that is the language that you deal with. But if you say, no, for me, language is anything between human spirits, human animals, then we would be forced by circumstances to come up with a conversational analytical method that capture this new arena that we are talking about. But that's not the way this thing is. I mean, scholarly, the scholarship is going. But nobody listens to what I say anyway, so it doesn't matter. Okay. Is it Kim or Vishna who is going to be closing the whole thing and telling us who's coming next?